Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. We're skipping the usual pleasantries today because we have a massive, honestly incredibly complex, and frankly mind-blowing mission ahead of us.
We really do.
Today, we are exploring the fascinating, sometimes terrifying mechanics of the human mind. We're looking directly at how you, me, and literally everyone else can get inexplicably, frustratingly stuck.
Right.
We are talking about debilitating phobias that dictate where you can go, the spiraling feedback loops of anxiety that keep you up at night, the heavy, crushing weight of depression, and most importantly, how different psychological therapies actually attempt to pull us out of those dark places.
Which is no small feat.
Not at all. We are pulling from an incredibly dense, profoundly insightful university lecture recording that covers cognitions, social behavior, and the meteoric rise of cognitive behavioral therapies. I mean, this material is essentially a masterclass in how our mental wiring gets tangled up and the incredibly varied, sometimes shocking ways we try to untangle it.
What's fascinating here is that we aren't just looking at dry, abstract textbook theories that exist only in a laboratory. We are looking at the literal battleground of the human psyche. We are going to be comparing some radically different, deeply opposing approaches to human suffering. We'll be examining classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and cognitive therapies. But more than that, we are going to explore the fierce, sometimes incredibly stubborn and deeply entrenched divide in the psychological world.
Good tribalism.
Exactly, the tribalism. On one side, you have the behaviorists. They care strictly about what you do and how to change it right now. And on the other side, you have the psychoanalysts who care deeply about the hidden, dark, unconscious reasons why you do it in the first place.
And whether you are currently trying to break a stubborn bad habit or you're trying to understand your own sudden, terrifying panic attacks, or maybe you just want to know why a good friend of yours is absolutely terrified of dogs and crosses the street whenever they see one, this deep dive is going to provide you with the ultimate shortcut to understanding how our mental wiring actually works.
It really is the invisible architecture of your everyday life.
It is. So to start understanding how we fix a broken circuit in the brain, we have to look at how the brain learns to be terrified in the first place. The source material spends a lot of time on phobias, and it contrasts two completely different ways of attacking them: systematic desensitization and flooding. Now, systematic desensitization sounds pretty gentle, right?
It is, yeah. It's a very gradual, almost polite process, which makes sense if you consider how overwhelming a phobia can be.
Right.
Let's say you have a severe phobia of elevators. The very thought of those metal doors closing makes your chest tight. In systematic desensitization, a therapist isn't going to push you into an elevator anytime soon. They might first have you sit in a deeply comfortable chair in a safe, quiet office, teach you some deep muscle relaxation techniques, and then ask you to simply picture an elevator in your mind.
Just the idea of it.
Just hold the image. If your anxiety spikes, you stop, relax, and try again.
So you're just fighting the idea of the elevator before you ever face the real thing.
Precisely. And then, maybe weeks later in the next session, you might look at a photograph of an elevator. It is a highly graded hierarchy of fear. You inch your way up. But the material then introduces the alternative, which is a technique called flooding. And flooding is an in vivo exposure technique.
In vivo?
Right, in vivo is a clinical way of saying in real life. You aren't imagining the fear. You aren't looking at a picture. You are plunged directly, physically, into the nightmare scenario.
And the examples the source gives for flooding are incredibly intense. Let's go back to that elevator phobia. In a flooding scenario, the therapist doesn't show you a Polaroid. They take you to a high-rise building, they walk you into the actual metal box of the elevator, they hit the button, the doors lock, and you are not allowed to escape.
You were trapped.
You are trapped in that space with the therapist until you have completely physiologically calmed down.
And you have to put yourself in the shoes of the person experiencing this. For someone with a severe phobia, the moment those doors close, their autonomic nervous system sounds a 5-alarm fire, their heart rate explodes, they start sweating, their breathing becomes shallow and rapid, and their brain is screaming that they're in mortal danger.
It's pure panic.
Pure panic. And to understand why a highly trained therapist would subject a patient to something so seemingly torturous, we have to look at the underlying mechanics of how fear works, and, more importantly, how it sustains itself. Why do phobias stick around for decades? The behaviorist gives a very clear answer, and it's avoidance behavior.
Right, because if you're terrified of elevators, you take the stairs. Every single day, you walk up 6 flights of stairs.
Exactly. And what happens the moment you make the decision to take the stairs instead of the elevator?
You feel a massive wave of relief. You think, thank God I'm safe.
And that relief is the trap. That wave of release inadvertently reinforces the fear. You are training your brain. You are sending a signal that says, I survived today because I avoided the elevator. The avoidance becomes the reward. So by physically preventing escape during a flooding session, the therapist is cutting off that escape route.
You literally can't run away.
You can't. The nervous system is forced to endure the panic. But here is the biological secret of flooding. The human body cannot sustain a state of absolute peak physiological panic indefinitely. It is biologically impossible.
You just run out of energy.
Yes. Eventually, the adrenaline stops pumping at maximum capacity, the heart rate has to slow down, and the physiological arousal drops.
The body just exhausts itself.
The nervous system is forced to habituate to the stimulus. The patient is standing in the elevator, the terror has peaked and is now receding, and they are forced to process a new reality. I am in the elevator, I didn't escape, and yet I am not dead. The connection between the elevator and the conditioned emotional response of terror is literally extinguished. The wire is cut.
There's another unbelievable example of this in the material involving a woman with a severe escalator phobia. And this wasn't just a mild discomfort, it was completely debilitating. She couldn't navigate normal daily life, couldn't go to certain stores, couldn't work in certain buildings. So her therapist takes her to a massive, busy department store.
Right.
He walks her right up to the escalator, gets her on it, and they ride it to the top floor. And then they immediately ride it back down. Up and down, up and down. The source describes this as one continuous, relentless session. They just kept riding it until her nervous system simply gave up the fight.
Just wore it out.
Exactly. And according to the data, in just 4 or 5 of these intense flooding treatments, she was entirely cured of a phobia that had plagued her for years.
When you look at the efficiency of the treatment, it is staggering. The material also brings up dog phobias, noting that you could theoretically take a person, drive them to a humane society, place them right in the middle of a pen filled with loud, barking, jumping wild dogs, and just stand there, preventing them from leaving until the panic subsides.
Which is terrifying.
It is. Now, the source adds a massive, very necessary medical caveat here. You absolutely cannot do this with people who have a vulnerability to heart attacks or severe cardiovascular issues. The sheer physiological stress of the initial panic spike could trigger a genuine medical emergency.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When you hear about these flooding techniques, locking a terrified person in an elevator, forcing someone onto an escalator for hours, dropping them into a pen of barking dogs, it sounds completely inhumane. It sounds like a psychological horror movie. Like taking someone who is afraid of spiders and just dropping them into a dark cave crawling with tarantulas. You hear this and think, I would never let a therapist do that to me or anyone I love. It sounds like literal torture.
It does. It violates our basic instinct to comfort someone who is in distress. But this raises an important question, and the source frames the ethics of this in a very compelling, challenging way. We have to weigh the acute, temporary discomfort of the treatment against the chronic, long-term suffering of the disease.
Right.
Let's look at the dog phobia. Imagine you have a debilitating fear of dogs, and you live in a suburban neighborhood where everyone has a dog. Every single time you open your front door to get the mail, you are gripped by sheer terror. You can't take walks. You can't visit certain friends. Your entire life is restricted. You are living in a self-imposed, invisible prison of fear.
So the ethical question is, which is worse?
Exactly. Is it more humane to let a person suffer that daily debilitating grief and limitation for 40 years? To let them live a fraction of a life? Or is it more humane to subject them to a few genuinely terrifying, terrible hours in a dog kennel to break the conditioning and grant them a lifetime of freedom? From the strict behaviorist perspective, prioritizing short-term comfort over long-term freedom is the real cruelty. Enduring a few bad hours to cure a lifelong affliction is considered the ultimate act of humanity.
That completely flips the perspective. But still, I can imagine a lot of listeners thinking they'd rather keep taking the stairs than get locked in that elevator. Luckily, the material notes you don't always have to go full Indiana Jones spider cave. There is a middle ground, which is called graded exposure. It's halfway between just imagining the fear in a comfy chair and full-blown flooding. The material describes a case study of treating a dog phobia using this method. They started by putting the phobic person in a room with just one very small, relatively calm dog.
And even that is highly distressing for the patient at first.
They are still very upset. But because the stimulus is manageable, it's a small dog, not a pack of wild hounds, their nervous system calms down much faster. They get used to the small dog being in the room. Then the therapist dials up the intensity. They drive to the Humane Society. They don't go into the pens, they just stand in the hallway and look at the animals from a safe distance through the chain link.
Slowly turning up the volume.
Exactly. Once the patient habituates to the noise and the sight, they move again. Finally, they are placed in a room with a large dog. It's still in vivo, it's still real-life exposure, but the volume knob of fear is turned up slowly rather than cranked to 10 immediately. And again, the source notes, it didn't take many sessions to cure the phobia completely.
Graded exposure is highly effective because it builds self-efficacy along the way. But the core principle remains exactly the same as flooding. The only way out of the fear is through it. You cannot avoid the stimulus. You must confront it until the conditioned response breaks. Now, speaking of breaking conditioned responses, the material transitions into a fascinating, albeit extreme, historical example from the 1960s. This is a technique called aversive conditioning. And this isn't about curing a fear of something external. It's about eliminating an undesired internal desire.
Oh, the Davidson case. We have to talk about this because it really shows the absolute extremes of behavioral psychology. There was a man in the 1960s who suffered from intense, deeply ingrained sadistic sexual fantasies. These thoughts plagued him. He felt immense guilt, and he desperately wanted to get rid of them so he could function normally. So he goes to a behavioral therapist, and the therapist uses aversive conditioning. The instruction was this: every single time this man started to have one of these aggressive, sadistic fantasies, he was instructed to vividly, with all of his senses, imagine drinking from a bubbling bowl of human urine and feces.
It's a profoundly visceral, deeply unpleasant example.
It's disgusting.
It is. But mathematically, in the realm of conditioning, it makes perfect sense. The goal of aversive conditioning is to take a stimulus, in this case, the internal self-generated cognitive fantasy, that produces a positive or arousing response, and forcibly pair it with an intensely negative, repulsive emotional and physical response.
I mean, imagining consuming human waste will absolutely 100% kill the mood. There's no coming back from that.
Exactly. And that is the mechanism of action. The therapist is essentially hacking the man's neural pathways. He is forcing a massive traffic jam between the arousal network and the disgust network. By repeatedly, forcefully pairing the sadistic image with the deeply nauseating image, the brain eventually conflates the two. The material reports that this effectively broke the connection. The man's aggressive fantasies were eliminated because his brain literally could no longer experience the fantasy without simultaneously triggering absolute, overwhelming physical disgust. The desire was poisoned at the root.
It's a crude, incredibly harsh method, but the results speak for themselves. And this specific dynamic, fixing the immediate behavior without necessarily asking where the behavior came from, brings us to a crucial philosophical divide. This is the bedrock of everything else we're going to explore today: the deep, fundamental divide between the psychoanalyst and the behaviorist. The source illustrates this divide brilliantly, using a hypothetical case study of a woman who comes into a clinic with a severe, irrational fear of babies.
This comparison is brilliant because it's not just a disagreement over medical treatment. It's a clash over the very nature of human existence. If this woman, who is terrified of infants, goes to a traditional psychoanalyst, someone trained in the Freudian tradition, the analyst's first, foundational assumption is that the fear of the baby is an illusion.
An illusion.
Yes, it is merely a surface symptom, a symbolic manifestation of a much deeper, hidden, and likely terrifying unconscious trauma.
The analyst assumes the baby isn't the real problem.
Exactly. The analyst assumes we don't actually know why she is afraid. So what is the treatment? The analyst might spend 3, 4, maybe 5 years exploring her deep past. They will analyze her dreams. They will look for repressed memories. Did she have a traumatic abortion years ago that she hasn't emotionally processed? Was she somehow abused as a child? Do you have deeply repressed, culturally taboo childhood fantasies involving her own parents? Does this fear of babies actually represent a deep, unacknowledged internal conflict about her own identity as a woman, or a terror of becoming a mother herself and losing her independence?
It's an entire excavation.
It is. The psychoanalyst believes that the human mind is a dark, complex labyrinth, and you must painstakingly excavate these unconscious meanings to achieve true, lasting healing. If you just cure the fear of babies without finding the root cause, the psychoanalyst argues the underlying trauma will just pop up somewhere else as a different symptom.
But then you have the behaviorist. The behaviorist looks at that exact same woman sitting in the exact same chair and says, we can completely 100% ignore all of that. The behaviorist's perspective is aggressively, almost ruthlessly pragmatic. They say, this woman's problem is that she is afraid of babies. Period. That is the only reason she called my office. She didn't come here because she wants to dissect her childhood relationship with her father, and she didn't come here to interpret her dreams. She wants to be able to go to her sister's house, sit next to her newborn niece, and not have a full-blown panic attack.
It is a radical simplification of the human experience. The behaviorist's solution: expose her to babies. Use graded exposure or flooding. Break the conditioned connection between the visual stimulus of the baby and the physiological response of fear. Rewire the nervous system.
And the behaviorist argues, why spend 3 years and tens of thousands of dollars on a psychoanalyst's couch exploring the theoretical, symbolic meanings of infants when you could undergo a behavioral exposure treatment and be completely, verifiably cured of the actual fear in 6 weeks?
It's a blunt approach, and to some it feels shallow. It feels like treating the cough without treating the infection. But when it comes to specific phobias, spiders, heights, enclosed spaces, the empirical, verifiable results of the behavioral approach are incredibly difficult to argue with. It works. Fast.
It really makes you question what we consider therapy to actually be. Is the goal of therapy deep self-discovery and understanding the narrative of your life? Or is it just a mechanical process of fixing a broken circuit in the brain so you can get back to work? It's a heavy question. But everything we've talked about so far, the phobias, the reflexes, the heart rates, that's all involuntary. That's your autonomic nervous system doing things without your permission. But what about the choices we actively make? How do therapists reshape our actual voluntary behavior? That brings us to a whole different toolkit. Let's explore the world of operant conditioning, the realm of the carrot, the stick, and the token.
Yes, this is a massive and crucial shift in the paradigm. Classical conditioning, the Pavlovian response we just discussed with the elevators and the dogs, is entirely about those involuntary reflexes. Operant conditioning, pioneered by figures like B.F. Skinner, is about shaping voluntary behavior. It's about the choices you make every single day and how those choices are dictated by the consequences that immediately follow them. You operate on your environment, and your environment operates back on you.
The source material gives some great, incredibly relatable, everyday examples of this. The lecturer actually uses the very room he is standing in to explain the concept to his students. He notes that as he is standing at the podium lecturing, if he explains a complex concept and the students in the front row grimace, furrow their brows, or look confused, he instantly, almost subconsciously, changes his teaching style. He slows down, he clarifies his point, he uses a different analogy. The student's grimace is a consequence, a negative feedback signal that modifies his voluntary behavior. He tries something different to get his desired response, which is nods of understanding.
And we have to look at the flip side of that transaction. When he clarifies the point, and the students finally nod and look relieved, the students have just achieved their desired response. They got the professor to make sense. Which means, according to the laws of operant conditioning, those students are highly, highly likely to grimace again the next time he is unclear. They've been trained. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the material is making a profound point about human interaction. Society itself, your workplace, your marriage, your friend group, it is all essentially one massive, invisible operant conditioning grid.
We're constantly training each other.
Constantly. In every social situation, whether we realize it or not, we are constantly reinforcing, punishing, and conditioning the people around us. Every smile, every frown, every laugh at a joke, every moment you withhold eye contact, these are all contingencies of reinforcement shaping the behavior of everyone you interact with.
When you look at the world through that lens, it totally changes how you view things, especially parenting. The source brings up an incredibly common example, a 21-month-old toddler who is constantly throwing epic window-rattling tantrums. Now, if the parents take that toddler to a behavioral therapist, the therapist doesn't put the toddler on a tiny couch and ask about their emotional development. The therapist barely even looks at the toddler. The therapist looks directly at the parents. They examine the contingencies of reinforcement because very, very often parents inadvertently, out of sheer exhaustion, reward a child's bad behavior.
It is one of the most common traps in human psychology. Imagine the child starts screaming in the middle of a grocery store. The parent is embarrassed, they are tired, they just want peace. So they hand the child a toy or a piece of candy to quiet them down. The parent thinks, I solved the problem. The screaming stopped. But the operant conditioning reality is devastatingly different. The parents just pay the child for screaming. The child's brain registers a very clear equation. Screaming at the top of my lungs equals acquiring candy.
And then the parents wonder why the child screams louder the next time they go to the store. It's because the parents train them to do it. It's essentially the psychology of a slot machine. If the child screams and gets nothing 9 times, but gets candy on the 10th time, they will scream forever because they know a payout is eventually possible. It's called intermittent reinforcement, and it is the hardest behavior to break.
Exactly. Which is why behavior modification in family therapy often has very little to do with treating the child directly. It is almost entirely about retraining the parents. The therapist helps the parents change their reaction to the stimulus. If the parents can hold the line and completely remove the reinforcement, if they stop reacting, stop giving anxious attention, stop yielding to the tantrum, and simply let the child scream without a payout, the child's behavior will inevitably, mathematically change. Why? Because the behavior is no longer serving a purpose. It is no longer profitable for the child to expend the energy throwing a tantrum.
It's all about behavioral economics. And this concept of creating an economy around behavior leads directly into one of the most famous and somewhat controversial applications of operant conditioning discussed in the material: token economies. These were massively popular in institutional settings in the 1960s, and variants of them are still used today, particularly in psychiatric wards for adolescents or in facilities for individuals who are severely mentally or emotionally impaired. It's exactly what it sounds like. The therapists create a microeconomy based entirely on behavior.
The mechanics of a token economy are straightforward, but the psychological impact is incredibly powerful. You establish a clear set of expected socially acceptable behaviors. If a patient performs one of these activities, making their bed in the morning, attending group therapy without causing a disruption, maintaining personal hygiene, helping clean the common area, they earn a token. This could be a literal plastic chip, a star on a chart, or points in a digital system. These tokens act as a secondary reinforcer. They have no value on their own, but they act as currency. They can be exchanged for primary reinforcers or privileges.
The source mentions exchanging them for things that the patients actually want. In the 60s, it might have been cigarettes. Or it could be extra free time in the recreation room, access to better food, or the highly coveted ability to go outside for an hour. And while punishment can be used like taking tokens away for violent or disruptive behavior, the system generally operates much more effectively and with less friction on the basis of positive reinforcement, earning your way to comfort.
The material shares a highly detailed personal anecdote from a practitioner who worked on a psychiatric unit for severely troubled adolescents that utilized a level system based entirely on these principles. He paints a very vivid, almost stark picture of how this was enforced. When teenagers first arrived on the unit, they were automatically placed at level 1. And level 1 meant total, absolute restriction. They could not leave the unit under any circumstances. They had a very early, strictly enforced bedtime, which, as anyone who has met a teenager knows, is absolute torture. They had virtually no privileges. They were essentially at the absolute bottom of the behavioral economy.
But the catch is, the keys to their own freedom were entirely in their own hands. The moment those adolescents began producing the desired behaviors, waking up on time, following the ward rules, participating constructively in the program, they started earning their way up. They would graduate to level 2. Level 2 added a few minor privileges, maybe a slightly later bedtime or access to the TV room. And as they continued to comply and prove they could handle responsibility, they would move to level 3 and eventually reach level 4. By level 4, they had earned significant, highly desired freedom, like unescorted visits completely off the hospital grounds.
It is a brilliantly simple, remarkably effective system, and it is particularly vital for patient populations who, as the source points out, might not possess the cognitive capacity or the emotional regulation to utilize traditional talking therapies. If you have a severely intellectually impaired patient or a highly volatile oppositional adolescent, you cannot sit them down in a chair and have a nuanced philosophical debate about the civic virtues of making their bed and being polite to staff. The cognitive hardware for that conversation might not be accessible, but they can absolutely instinctively understand that making the bed equals receiving a token and holding 5 tokens equals a candy bar or an hour of video games. You are speaking the universal language of behavioral economics.
But I have to say, hearing about this level system where staff control every aspect of a patient's comfort and freedom based on compliance, it sounds a little dystopian. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel where citizens are tracked for good behavior.
And that is a very astute observation. And the source material includes a highly crucial warning about the profound vulnerability of token economies. While they are undeniably effective tools for shaping socially acceptable behaviors and managing chaotic wards, they can be abused incredibly easily. Think about the power dynamic. You are creating a closed system where an institution, and the individuals working within it, holds absolute, unchecked power over a person's most basic privileges, comforts, and freedoms.
Right. Who decides what a good behavior is?
Exactly. It requires rigorous, constant ethical oversight to ensure that the contingencies of reinforcement are actually being used for the genuine benefit, growth, and rehabilitation of the patient. The danger is that the token economy simply becomes a tool for staff convenience. It becomes a way to create docile, quiet, easily managed patients rather than healthy, functional human beings. The line between therapy and institutional control on a token economy is razor thin.
That power dynamic is definitely something that haunts the history of psychology. So we've covered the body's involuntary reflexes with classical conditioning. We've covered shaping outward voluntary behavior with operant conditioning. But if we can fix the body's false alarms and we can train outward behavior, what about the actual thoughts swirling around in our heads? What about the internal monologue that tells us we are worthless or that the world is dangerous? That brings us to one of the biggest seismic shifts in psychological history, the cognitive revolution. This is where we learn that sometimes thinking actually makes it so.
The rise of cognitive therapy is a fascinating piece of academic and clinical history because it wasn't born out of nowhere. The material explains that it actually emerged from a group of highly trained but deeply disgruntled psychoanalysts. Pioneers of the cognitive movement like Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck were originally deeply steeped in the Freudian psychoanalytic tradition. They were trained to look for hidden drives in childhood trauma. But over time, they grew incredibly frustrated with the reality of clinical practice. Psychoanalysis, by its very design, is notoriously non-directive. The therapist sits, listens, and waits. They wait for the patient's unconscious material to slowly, organically unfold over hundreds of sessions.
The source material actually jokes about patients complaining about this. Patients would say, I went to that therapist and all he did was sit there in silence and stare at me. I could just stay home and stare at myself in a mirror if I wanted that. Give me some advice. Tell me what to do. Ellis and Beck looked at their patients, who were deeply suffering from depression and anxiety, and felt that they simply were not getting better fast enough. They felt a moral obligation to develop a technology of treatment that was more directive, more active, and importantly, based on observable, experimental data rather than abstract, unprovable Freudian drives.
And out of that clinical frustration came the core premise of cognitive therapy, which was highly radical at the time. The premise is this: severe depression and acute anxiety do not necessarily stem from deeply buried childhood trauma or mysterious unconscious conflicts about your parents. They stem from unrealistic, irrational, demonstrably false thinking occurring in the present moment. The fundamental equation of the cognitive revolution is brilliantly simple. Change the underlying thought, and you will inevitably change the resulting feeling.
Albert Ellis founded something called rational emotive therapy, which was one of the very first aggressive variants of this cognitive approach. He believed that the root of our emotional misery is found in the way we talk to ourselves, specifically the implicit, unspoken assumptions we carry around like invisible rulebooks. For example, a patient comes into his office absolutely devastated, crying because they had a mild argument with a friend. They feel awful, worthless. Ellis wouldn't ask about their relationship with their mother. He would dig into the implicit assumption driving the devastation. Through questioning, he might uncover that the patient holds a deep, irrational, utterly impossible belief that everyone I meet must like me and approve of me at every single moment, or else my life is terrible and I am worthless.
Ellis called this masturbation, the dangerous habit of saying things must be a certain way. And Aaron Beck, who became perhaps the most prominent and influential figure in cognitive therapy, expanded on this architecture, specifically regarding the mechanics of depression. Beck proposed what he called a cognitive triad. Beck argued that clinical depression is not just a generalized sadness, it is caused and sustained by irrational, systematically negative feelings in three distinct specific areas: negative feelings about the self, negative feelings about the world around them, and negative feelings about the future. If you view yourself as broken, the world is hostile, and the future is hopeless, you're trapped in the triad.
And Beck didn't just stop at the triad. He identified specific, identifiable cognitive distortions that depressed people systematically use to maintain this dark view of reality. And what's wild is that we all do these sometimes. You do this, I do this. Every person listening to this right now has probably committed a cognitive distortion today. But the source material emphasizes that while a healthy person might do it occasionally, a clinically depressed individual does it relentlessly. It becomes their entire operating system. Let's break down the major examples from the material. First, there is arbitrary inference. This is when you make a massive, sweeping, negative conclusion that has absolutely zero basis in factual reality.
It's drawing a conclusion when the evidence either is completely absent or actually points the other way. The source gives a great example of someone embarking on a new career path. They say to the therapist, "There is no way I can do this new job. I'm going to fail miserably." The therapist, acting as a detective, asks, "Well, let's look at the data. How have you done in your past careers and schooling?" And the person admits, "Oh, I've actually been highly successful in everything I've done." So the therapist asks a logical question, "Then why on earth do you think you'll fail now?" And the person replies, "Well, that was the past. The past doesn't mean anything. Why would I think I could do well in the future?"
It's an entirely arbitrary jump. The historical evidence strongly, almost overwhelmingly, suggests they will succeed, but their brain actively ignores the positive evidence to maintain the negative belief. Another incredibly common distortion is selective abstraction. This is basically having a mental filter installed in your brain that only lets in the bad stuff. Think about social media. You post a picture, you get 99 amazing glowing comments, and one person says, "Nice shirt, but weird lighting." You will ignore the 99 compliments and obsess over the weird lighting comment for 3 days. That's selective abstraction. In the workplace, you have a 30-minute performance review where your boss praises your work for 29 minutes but offers one minor piece of constructive criticism. When you walk out of that room, you selectively abstract out all the praise and you convince yourself your boss hates you and you're getting fired.
The depressed mind acts like a magnet for negative data and a repellent for positive data. And then there is overgeneralization. This is taking one single isolated negative event and assuming it applies to literally everything everywhere forever. A patient comes into the clinic in tears and says, "My relationship of 6 months just ended. This is a catastrophe because this proves I will never find anyone ever again. I will die alone." They take a sample size of one single breakup and wildly project it onto the rest of their entire existence.
And this is where the cognitive therapist's truly unique method comes into play. Aaron Beck called it collaborative empiricism. This is a huge departure from the psychoanalyst. The cognitive therapist doesn't act as an all-knowing, silent guru interpreting dreams from on high. The therapist acts like a fellow scientist sitting side by side with the patient. They treat the patient's negative, catastrophic beliefs not as undisputed facts, but as hypotheses. And what do you do with a hypothesis in science? You test it rigorously against the cold, hard evidence.
The source material provides a lengthy, almost theatrical, and deeply illuminating example of this collaborative empiricism in action. It's the story of the unlovable man. It is worth dissecting this dialogue carefully because it perfectly illustrates how systematically, almost surgically, a cognitive therapist shatters these mental distortions. So, picture a man coming into the therapist's office, profoundly, heavily depressed. He sits down and says, "Doc, my wife of 20 years just left me. It just goes to show what I've always secretly known. I'm a completely worthless human being. If the woman who knew me best and longest can't love me, no one ever will. I am inherently, fundamentally unlovable."
Now, a normal friend might say, "Oh, don't say that, you're great." A psychoanalyst might ask about his mother. But the cognitive therapist does neither. The therapist doesn't comfort him and, crucially, doesn't validate the irrational feeling. The therapist immediately puts on the scientist hat and begins cross-examining the hypothesis. The therapist says, "Okay, let's back up. You are bringing me a hypothesis that states you are entirely, universally unlovable. Let's test that. Have you ever been in a romantic relationship before you met your wife?" The man thinks for a second and says, "Yes, actually. I had a serious relationship for a couple of years in my 20s before I met her." The therapist asks, "Did that woman love you?" The man admits, "Yes, she did. Very much. But I ended it because she just wasn't the right fit for me."
Notice what the therapist is doing here. They are already introducing contradictory data into the patient's closed system. The therapist keeps digging. Okay, so we have one person who loved you. Has anyone else ever loved you? What about your family? What about your mother? The man sighs and says, "Yeah, I guess my mother loves me. She knows me very well, flaws and all." So the therapist summarizes the new data. Okay, so we now have at least 2 people who know you intimately and have loved you. Given that evidence, is it really an empirical, undeniable fact that no one is capable of loving you?
But the depressed mind is stubborn. It fights back to protect its misery. The man rationalizes the distortion to keep it alive. He says, "Doc, you don't get it. Those are just 2 single, isolated cases out of my whole life. Look at the billions of people on Earth who could potentially love me, but don't. All those people out there in the world haven't taken to me. That proves I'm unlovable."
And this is where the therapist uses brilliant, almost humorous, absurd logic to finally break the back of the distortion. The therapist leans in and asks, "Well, let's look at those billions of people. How many visits have you made to China recently? How about India?" I mean, it's totally confused. What? No, I haven't been to China or India, the therapist says. "But you just cited the billions of people out there who have rejected you. Let's look closer to home. How long were you married?" And that says 20 years. The therapist asks, have you been out at bars, joining clubs, or actively looking for a new romantic relationship during those 20 years of marriage? The man says, somewhat offended, of course not. I was married.
The therapist sets the trap perfectly. The therapist delivers the final logical blow. So let's review the facts. You haven't been looking for a partner for 2 decades. You haven't traveled to China or India to meet the billions of people you claim reject you. You have been entirely off the romantic market for 20 years. Does the fact that billions of absolute strangers haven't randomly knocked on your front door to profess their love for you really prove scientifically that you are inherently unlovable? And finally, the man's twisted logic completely crumbles under its own weight. He has to admit, gee, doc, I guess not. The hypothesis fails the test. The distortion is broken.
It's a relentless process. You systematically shatter distortion after distortion, piece by piece, until the patient is forced to see the mathematical fallacy of their own mind. But the work doesn't stop in the 50-minute therapy hour. The material strongly highlights the importance of homework in cognitive behavioral therapy. You can't just fix it in the office. The therapist gives the patient a charting sheet to carry with them. Every single time they feel a sudden wave of depression or anxiety hit them at home or at work or at the grocery store, they have to physically pull out the sheet and write down the data. What was I just doing? What was the exact specific thought that went through my head the millisecond before I felt sad? They learn to catch the errors in their own code in real time. And the source notes that this active, demanding approach can be a highly successful treatment for many different kinds of depression.
It empowers the patient. It doesn't make them reliant on the therapist forever. It teaches them the principles of the therapy so they can eventually become their own internal therapist. Now, this brings us to an incredibly exciting, almost cinematic part of the material, the ultimate masterclass. What happens when you take the classical conditioning we talked about first, the involuntary physical reflexes, and you combine it with the operant conditioning, the voluntary behaviors, and you integrate them both with the cognitive therapy we just discussed? What happens when you use all the weapons at once?
You get a comprehensive, highly sophisticated attack on some of the most terrifying, overwhelming mental experiences a human being can endure: panic attacks. To understand the treatment, we must first understand the absolute horror of the condition. The material introduces panic disorders as an incredibly visceral, full-body experience. It is not just feeling stressed or nervous. The lecturer describes it as the sudden, unprovoked feeling that the room is physically closing in on you. The oxygen is sucked out of the air. You feel an imminent, inescapable sense of doom, like you are having a massive, fatal heart attack and are about to die right there on the grocery store floor. You might feel a terrifying sense of depersonalization, like you are outside your own body, or that your mind is literally shattering into pieces and you are going permanently, irreparably insane.
It is a state of absolute, unadulterated terror. It's your fight or flight system activating as if a tiger just jumped out of the bushes, but there is no tiger. You're just sitting at your desk. And the material highlights the groundbreaking work of David Barlow, a prominent clinician and researcher who proposed an integrated treatment approach. Barlow's fundamental genius insight is that a panic attack is not just one simple thing. It is a complex syndrome made up of 4 distinct, interconnected components. And if you want to truly cure a panic disorder, you cannot just attack one part. You have to wage war on all 4 fronts simultaneously.
Let's break down those 4 components because they map perfectly onto the therapies we've discussed. First, there's the physiological component, the actual physical alarms going off in your autonomic nervous system, the racing, pounding heart, the dry mouth, the profusely sweaty palms, the intense shortness of breath. Second, there is the subjective component, the internal, indescribable emotional feeling of being terrified. Third, there is the cognitive component, the catastrophic thoughts racing through your mind at light speed, explicitly telling you, I am having a heart attack, I am dying, I am losing my mind. And fourth, the behavioral component, the intense, overwhelming drive to run away, to escape the room, to avoid whatever triggered the panic.
And Barlow also identified a secondary but incredibly massive complication in panic disorders: the fear of fear. This is fascinating. The source points out that most people actually experience at least one panic attack at some point in their lives, usually due to a period of extremely high stress or exhaustion. A single panic attack isn't inherently pathological, but for a certain subset of people, that first panic attack is so profoundly traumatic that they become utterly terrified of having another one. They start hyper-monitoring their own bodies. They scan themselves constantly. Is my heart beating a little fast? Do my lungs feel tight? Am I about to panic? And because they were so focused on it, their anxiety rises. The fear of the panic attack actually becomes the primary trigger that causes the next panic attack. It becomes a closed loop, self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's exactly like the famous Franklin D. Roosevelt quote the lecturer brings up. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The fear mechanism has become detached from reality and is feeding on its own signals. So, how does Barlow attack this monster on all four fronts? Let's start with the physiological component, the bodily alarms. Barlow uses a brilliant hack of the human body's false alarm system. Let's say a patient's primary trigger for panic is the feeling of breathlessness. The moment they feel short of breath, their brain screams, "I'm suffocating," initiate panic. Barlow uses an in vivo classical conditioning technique. He sits the patient down, has them wear a mask, and instructs them to breathe in a very specific, safe, but elevated amount of carbon dioxide.
Which sounds terrifying. Why give them CO2?
Because inhaling carbon dioxide naturally, biologically induces a strong, undeniable feeling of breathlessness and air hunger. The therapist is deliberately, artificially creating the exact physical sensation that terrifies the patient, but doing so in a highly controlled, medically safe environment. Crucially, to address the subjective feeling of helplessness, the therapist might even give the patient a physical button to turn the gas off whenever they want. This builds a vital sense of self-efficacy. The patient feels they have ultimate control over the fear. By repeatedly exposing the patient to the terrifying feeling of breathlessness over and over, while nothing dangerous actually happens, the nervous system habituates. The patient eventually realizes, okay, I feel short of breath, it's uncomfortable, but big deal, I'm not dying. The autonomic alarm is decoupled from the panic response. It is extinguished.
And he does the exact same thing for a racing heart. If a patient comes in terrified that their pounding heart means they're having a cardiac event, Barlow doesn't just sit on a couch and talk to them about their feelings. He gets them up. He has them run up and down a flight of stairs in the clinic over and over. Or he puts them on a treadmill and cranks up the speed. He forces them to run until their heart is absolutely pounding out of their chest, until they are sweating and panting and feel they can't stand it anymore. Then they stop. They realize they didn't have a heart attack. Then he makes them do it again and again. He induces the symptom until the brain learns, wait a minute, my heart is racing at 160 beats per minute, but I am not having a panic attack. It's just a harmless physical sensation.
That aggressively addresses the physiological false alarms. Then, simultaneously, Barlow attacks the cognitive component. He challenges the catastrophic fantasies, just like the cognitive therapist did with our unlovable man earlier. Let's say the panic is triggered specifically by public speaking. And the cognitive distortion is, if I panic on stage, everyone will see me fall apart, I will be humiliated, and my career will be ruined. Barlow will sit down with the data. He'll ask, how many times have you given a public lecture in your career? The patient says, probably 500 times. Barlow asks, have you ever experienced internal panic during those 500 lectures? The patient says, yes, almost every time. Barlow asks the critical question. In those 500 lectures, has anyone in the audience ever actually noticed, interrupted you, or approached you afterward to say you look like you were having a panic attack? The patient realizes, well, no, never. Barlow then dismantles the logic. Given a historical data set of 500 speeches where absolutely no one noticed your internal state, what is the empirical logical likelihood that they will suddenly miraculously notice next time?
The catastrophic thought is neutralized by data. And then there's the behavioral component. Remember, the behavioral urge of a panic attack is to escape. You want to run out the door. Barlow absolutely refuses to allow avoidance because avoidance reinforces the fear. If you are afraid of panicking in a specific conference room, he gives you a strict behavioral plan that actively prevents you from escaping that room. He forces you to stay in the room, feeling the anxiety, until the panic response naturally exhausts itself and extinguishes. And finally, addressing the subjective and physiological elements together in a practical way, he teaches specific deep breathing exercises.
And there's a very specific physiological reason for this. People who are panicking tend to take shallow gasps or they hold their breath entirely. This actually creates an imbalance of oxygen and CO2 in the blood, which chemically mimics suffocation and makes the panic physically worse. Teaching slow, diaphragmatic, deep breathing replaces the counterproductive gasping with a biological calming mechanism that forces the parasympathetic nervous system to engage and slow the heart down.
So what does this all mean? It means you have a remarkably robust, multi-pronged, inescapable attack on a terrifying condition. You are hitting the body, the thoughts, and the actions all at once. The source material notes that this integrating approach is so undeniably effective, so empirically proven, that even hardcore psychoanalysts who are fundamentally philosophically opposed to surface-level behavioral treatments will openly admit they would refer a patient to a CBT approach for treating active panic attacks. As the lecturer points out from his own perspective as a psychoanalytically oriented practitioner, trying to use deep insight therapy to find the hidden childhood meaning of a panic attack while a patient's heart is beating 160 times a minute in your office is largely futile. Insight alone rarely stops a racing heart. You need the behavioral tools to put out the fire before you can investigate what caused it.
Which is a perfect segue into the next crucial phase of our deep dive, the scorecard. The lecturer takes a massive step back, looks at the entire landscape of modern psychology, and evaluates the triumphs and the severe blind spots of the entire cognitive behavioral approach. We've seen how incredibly powerful it is, but it is a tool, and like any tool, it is not perfect. Let's start with the accomplishments, because they have revolutionized mental health. First on the scorecard is simplicity and parsimony.
Parsimony, that's a great word. Basically Occam's razor, right?
Exactly. Parsimony is a crucial guiding concept in all of science. It means that the best, most elegant theory is usually the one that can explain the most data using the fewest number of assumptions or complex principles. The lecturer marvels at this aspect of CBT. In just a few lectures, a first-year psychology student can fully grasp the core principles of cognitive behavioral theory: stimulus response, reinforcement punishment, and cognitive distortion. It is not a massive, convoluted text, yet that incredibly small, simple set of principles can explain a massive, intricate amount of human behavior and severe psychopathology. It isn't tangled up in overly complex, untestable, invisible theories of the mind like the Freudian ego, id, and superego.
And because it's so clear-cut, that leads directly to the second massive triumph: rigorous experimental testing. CBT was born in the laboratory, and it fiercely stays in the laboratory. It is eminently testable. If you want to test a psychoanalytic theory, you basically have to wait for a patient to have a profound symbolic dream on a couch, and then you have to subjectively interpret it. You can't prove it. But if you want to test a behavioral theory, you don't have to guess. You can test it on rats navigating a maze, you can test it on pigeons in a Skinner box pecking for food, or you can test it on a classroom full of college students.
You can isolate and control the variables precisely. If you want to know if depressed people actually have more negative, distorted thoughts than anxious people, you don't have to rely on anecdotal clinical intuition. You hand 1,000 people a validated, standardized questionnaire, you gather the hard data, you run the statistical analysis, and you get an objective answer. This provided a soundly empirical, evidence-based, scientifically respected foundation for psychology that it desperately needed to be taken seriously alongside the hard medical sciences.
And all that science leads to the third accomplishment, which is the bottom line: high efficacy. The results are simply astounding. The source notes that these CBT approaches can show up to a 90% success rate in reducing or eliminating severe panic cases. 90%. And the lecturer makes a very important, highly relevant comparison here regarding standard medical treatments for these conditions. Many psychiatrists, when faced with a panicking patient, will prescribe anti-anxiety medications like Xanax or other benzodiazepines, which work by chemically blocking the neurotransmitters responsible for arousal, like adrenaline. They also frequently prescribe SSRI antidepressants for anxiety, since the brain's neurotransmitter systems are so deeply linked.
But the lecturer points out a major fundamental flaw with the purely pharmacological approach: the relapse rate. These medications can be highly, almost magically effective in the short term for suppressing the symptoms of anxiety and depression. They lower the volume of the suffering. But very often, the moment you take the patient off the drug, the anxiety or the depression comes roaring right back with a vengeance. Why? Because the underlying psychological problem hasn't actually been solved. The alarm bell has merely been chemically muffled. In stark contrast, successful cognitive behavioral treatments do not rely on external chemicals. They actively teach the patient new cognitive skills and literally, physically rewire the neural pathways in the brain through habituation and exposure. Therefore, the long-term results of CBT frequently outperform or significantly outlast medication because the patient carries the cure within their own learned behavior. They take the new wiring with them wherever they go.
90% success for severe panic without lifelong medication is an incredible triumph. But the lecturer is very fair. He isn't a cheerleader for CBT. He flips the scorecard over to look at the dark side. What are the limitations, the failures, and the blind spots of the cognitive behavioral paradigm? And the first major critique is a philosophical one that hits hard. CBT essentially leaves out the heart. The lecturer notes a staggering fact. You could read 1,000 pages of Albert Bandura, who is one of the absolute foundational, legendary figures of social cognitive theory, and you would literally never even know that human beings mate.
It is a glaring, almost bizarre omission for a theory attempting to explain human nature. The lecturer points out the deep absurdity of constructing a comprehensive theory of human personality that completely systematically ignores sexual self-concept, romantic drives, passionate love, and the messy, irrational, deeply feeling side of human existence. CBT is a theory that is entirely brilliantly focused on people with heads treating humans as rational, thinking, calculating, information processing machines. But it largely ignores the fact that we are animals with hearts and incredibly complex biological drives. It tends to sanitize human nature, ignoring the darker, more complex, and less logical sides of who we are.
The lecturer gives a fascinating, somewhat disturbing example of this regarding psychological research into delinquent, violent boys. CBT researchers conducted very well-designed, rigorous laboratory studies and found that delinquent boys tend to make what they call hostile attributions. Basically, if you share a video of two kids bumping into each other in a hallway to a delinquent boy, he will automatically assume it was done on purpose with hostile, aggressive intent. He thinks that guy wants to fight, whereas a non-delinquent boy watching the exact same video will assume it was just a clumsy accident.
And that hostile attribution bias is a completely valid, scientifically proven cognitive finding. It's great data. But this raises an important question, and it's the question the clinician asks. What happens when we stop our analysis purely at the cognitive level? The lecturer, speaking from his own gritty clinical experience in group therapy, points out what the pristine CBT research completely, utterly misses. These boys often deeply, viscerally enjoy their aggression. The cognitive account explains the mental trigger for the violence, but it entirely ignores the emotional, physiological pleasure of the act itself.
The lecturer shares an anecdote from a group therapy session to illustrate this, and it really shifts the tone. He listened to a delinquent boy recount an experience of getting into a fight. The boy describes sitting on top of another kid's chest and just pummeling his face over and over until the kid's nose started to visibly spurt blood. And the horrifying part wasn't just the memory of the violence, it was the way the boy told the story in the room. He was actively, visibly enjoying the aggression in that very moment. He was getting a real, palpable kick out of making the therapist and everyone else in the therapy group squirm uncomfortably as he graphically described the violence. A purely cognitive approach, sitting him down and trying to logically correct his hostile attributions with a worksheet, completely misses the profound, dark reality that the boy fundamentally enjoys the power and the violence.
Which leads directly to the second major limitation, a classic scientific trap. Method dictates theory. Because the CBT paradigm prides itself so heavily on rigorous empirical laboratory testing, it inherently, automatically restricts its theories to only encompass those things that can be easily observed and measured in a lab setting. The lecturer points out a massive blind spot. There is absolutely no concept of defense mechanisms in strict behavioral or cognitive theory. There is no concept of repression, no projection, no rationalization.
Which is crazy when you think about daily life, because as the lecturer says, even a 9-year-old intuitively understands the concept of a defense mechanism. We all know what it looks like when a friend is desperately rationalizing a terrible life decision just to avoid feeling guilty. We all know when someone is clearly in denial about a failing relationship. We see these psychological defenses operating everywhere, but because you cannot easily put an invisible, unconscious conflict or subtle defense mechanism into a test tube or measure it on a 1 to 5 Likert scale questionnaire, the behaviorists and cognitive psychologists just leave it out of their theory entirely. They pretend it doesn't exist because they can't measure it.
It creates a highly sanitized, overly simplistic, almost robotic model of the deeply flawed human mind. And when therapists strictly, rigidly adhere to that overly simplistic model, it can lead to dangerous, sometimes catastrophic, clinical blind spots. Now, the lecturer is impartial here. He readily admits there are terrible horror stories on both sides of the theoretical divide. He explicitly mentions the classic horror stories of psychoanalysis. A patient undergoing 5 agonizing years of expensive, fruitless psychoanalysis to find the root of a depression that could have been completely cured in 6 weeks with a simple biological prescription of Prozac. Or he mentions an analyst being so committed to being non-directive and silent that they treat a patient for years without ever noticing that the patient is showing up highly intoxicated to every single session.
But then he shares the horror stories of CBT, and they are chilling because they stem directly from this refusal to look deeper. He describes a case of a woman who suffered from a severe borderline personality disorder. Now, borderline personality disorder involves an awful, chaotic history of childhood trauma, deeply troubled, volatile relationships, an unstable sense of identity, and severe, sweeping emotional instability. She goes to a behaviorist for help. The behaviorist looks strictly at her observable surface symptoms. He notes that she reports feeling highly anxious and tense. He doesn't look for trauma. He concludes, logically based on his paradigm, your problem is simply that you do not know how to physically relax your body. So he prescribes her a simple mechanical muscle relaxation therapy.
It is a devastating, tragic misdiagnosis based on a rigidly shallow theoretical framework. A couple weeks after being taught to simply breathe and relax her muscles, this deeply disturbed woman made a very serious, nearly fatal suicide attempt and ended up in a psychiatric hospital. The lecturer argues forcefully that telling a profoundly traumatized borderline patient that their core fundamental problem is just tense muscles is an absurd, professionally negligent, and potentially lethal formulation of the case. And he notes that for decades, cognitive behavioral theories didn't even formally acknowledge the existence of personality disorders, precisely because they are so complex, so deeply ingrained, and so resistant to simple behavioral fixes.
The second horror story he shares is even wilder, and it sounds like a psychological thriller. A man had been in cognitive therapy for a full year. He eventually comes to our lecturer for a secondary evaluation. The man complains about having constant problems getting along with his wife and his coworkers. He says he's abrasive. As the man talks, the lecturer, who is analytically trained to listen to the way people speak, notices that the language the man uses to describe his interactions sounds incredibly subtly sadistic. So the lecturer, unlike a strict behaviorist, actually inquires about it. He pokes at the shadow. He digs below the observable surface.
And in doing so, he uncovers a terrifying, hidden reality. This man harbored vivid, highly active, incredibly violent internal fantasies. While he was smiling and interacting with people in his daily life, in his mind he was actively fantasizing about raping and murdering them. Now, it's crucial to note the man had never acted on these impulses and wasn't deemed an immediate, active threat to the public, but he was deeply, profoundly troubled by his complete lack of control over his own dark mind.
So the lecturer, stunned, asks the man, "You've been in cognitive therapy for a year. Did you ever discuss these violent rape and murder fantasies with your cognitive therapist?" And the man says, totally casually, "No, we just talked about my trouble with social skills." The cognitive therapist had spent an entire year doing superficial role-playing exercises with this man. If your coworker says this, you should smile and say that. And the therapist had even written up a glowing, positive progress report about how well the man's social skills were improving. The lecturer asks the man one more question. "Did you ever have these violent fantasies about your therapist?" And the man replies, "Oh, every single session. It was on my mind all the time I was sitting in her office."
When the lecturer asked the incredibly obvious question, why the man never told his therapist about the fantasies, the man simply replied, "She never asked." That right there is the ultimate danger of a theory that rigidly refuses to look below the observable surface. If your entire paradigm tells you that only conscious thoughts, explicit complaints, and observable behaviors matter, you will literally never think to ask about the dark, hidden, terrifying things lurking in the unconscious. You will be sitting in an office, happily practicing conversational social skills with a man who is actively fantasizing about murdering you.
Which brings us to our final section, and it's a bit meta. Section 6, the psychology of psychologists. After hearing all of this, the incredible, undeniable triumphs of CBT, its ability to cure phobias and panic, juxtaposed with its terrifying blind spots and refusal to acknowledge the deeper soul, you have to ask the obvious question. Why is the field so bitterly divided? Why isn't there just one unified, holistic perspective of psychology that takes the best tools of classical conditioning, the insights of operant conditioning, the logic of cognitive therapy, and the deep emotional understanding of psychoanalysis, and puts it all together into one supertherapy?
The answer lies in the deeply entrenched, almost tribal nature of academia and clinical practice. Psychologists, despite dedicating their entire lives to studying human bias, irrationality, and groupthink, are ironically incredibly susceptible to the exact same cognitive biases and rigid ideologies they diagnose in others. The lecturer shares a highly revealing, slightly depressing anecdote about his own attempts to bridge this grand divide. 5 or 6 years prior to this recording, he tried to publish a theoretical article that bravely attempted to integrate the classic psychoanalytic concept of transference, which is how a patient unconsciously projects unresolved feelings from their past onto their current therapist, with the modern cognitive psychology concept of information processing.
He was trying to be the peacemaker. He was trying to translate a murky Freudian idea into clean, modern cognitive language, showing how a cognitive therapist could actually use the idea of transference to better understand a patient's deeply ingrained interpersonal schemas, basically the invisible instruction manuals we write as kids on how to interact with people, which we then blindly follow as adults. So he writes the paper, and the journal editor sends it out for blind peer review. He sends it to one staunch psychoanalyst and one hardcore cognitive behaviorist. And the responses he got back were laughably, tragically stereotypical.
The psychoanalyst reviewer wrote back, completely dismissing the cognitive framework, and angrily demanded, but where are the drives? Where is the libido? Where is the deep unconscious? And the cognitive reviewer wrote back, completely dismissing the psychoanalytic framework, and bluntly asked, what is this drive crap? Neither side was even willing to engage with the vocabulary, let alone the underlying paradigm of the other. The lecturer notes the deep irony of the academic establishment. He points out that you generally have to establish yourself safely within one specific tribe, get a few orthodox papers published, and start citing your own narrow work before the gatekeepers will even allow you the luxury of presenting integrated cross-disciplinary ideas. The resistances among highly educated psychologists to seeing things differently are just as strong, if not stronger, than the resistances they battle in their own patients.
The lecturer admits his own bias in a wonderfully self-deprecating, honest way. He talks about the very first time he picked up a book by Albert Bandura, the famous cognitive behavioral theorist we mentioned earlier. The lecturer at the time was so deeply, thoroughly entrenched in a psychoanalytic Freudian worldview that he spent 12 hours reading Bandura's book, doing nothing but angrily scribbling the word moron in the margins of almost every page. He was furious at the text. It wasn't until 30 pages later that he finally stepped back, and psychoanalyzed himself. He asked, what does it actually mean about me that I am having this intense, visceral, angry reaction to a textbook? And he realized the uncomfortable truth. He was angry because Bandura was actually making a lot of sense. Bandura's clear, empirical theories fundamentally threatened the lecturer's safely established, complicated worldview.
That moment perfectly encapsulates both the tragedy and the comedy of the psychological profession. The very people tasked with curing rigid thinking and opening the minds of the public are often trapped in their own narrow, fiercely defended ideological camps. The lecturer ends his incredible series by expressing a profound hope that future generations of psychologists will finally drop the tribalism. He hopes they will figure out how to seamlessly integrate the undeniable reality of unconscious processes and defense mechanisms with the brilliant behavioral technologies of expectancies, self-efficacy, and conditioning. The goal must be moving beyond the theoretical camps to treat the whole complex, messy human being.
It is an absolutely incredible journey we've been on today. We started by locking terrified people in elevators and dropping them in wild dog pens to force their autonomic nervous systems to habituate. We explored how token economies in psychiatric wards can shape voluntary behavior like a miniature society. We watched a cognitive therapist relentlessly, logically shatter the irrational illusions of a deeply depressed man simply by asking him how many times he had been to China. We saw how David Barlow brilliantly hacked the body's physiological alarm system with CO2 masks and staircases to cure the terror of panic attacks. And we confronted the deeply unsettling reality that a rigidly trained therapist might spend a year teaching you polite social skills while completely dangerously missing the dark, violent fantasies swirling in your head. It shows us that no single therapy, no single perspective has all the answers to the infinite complexities of the human mind.
And that leaves us with a profound, almost unsettling question to consider as we close. If the strict behaviorists are right, and our environments and outward behaviors shape our internal thoughts, and if the cognitive therapists are right, and our internal thoughts strictly dictate our emotional feelings, and yet if the psychoanalysts are also right, and we still harbor deep, messy, unexamined, highly influential, unconscious drives from our childhood, how much of what you currently consider to be your unique, authentic personality is actually just a set of unexamined, conditioned habits? If you were to sit down today and apply the rigorous, unforgiving, collaborative empiricism of a cognitive therapist to your own core beliefs about who you are, what your worth is, and what you are truly capable of, how many of those foundational beliefs would actually survive the test?
That is something to truly think about as you go about your day. We encourage you to keep questioning your own implicit assumptions, keep rigorously testing the hypotheses of your own mind, and keep exploring the invisible frameworks that build your reality. Thank you so much for coming on this deep dive with us. Until next time, keep unpacking the world around you.